So we have our second guest coming on. Her name is Tisha Brooks, and she is a college professor, and her book is called, and I think this is her first book. It's called Spirit Deep: Recovering the Sacred in Black Women's Travel. So
Oh,
that's an amazing topic. I don't know if the travel is spiritual or actual, but we'll find out. So, Tisha, welcome to Black Authors Matter TV.
thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
You're welcome. Do you have a copy of your book handy?
I do.
Wonderful. Okay.
Ooh,
It's called
okay,
Spirit.
that's a thick. Turn that to the side. Oh, okay,
Yeah.
textbook.
All right.
There were
So,
just there were just too many women I had to write about, so that's how I ended up so big.
Oh, I see.
oh,
That's a
okay.
great segue into you telling us about the book. So, is this kind of are you giving us little snapshots of different women who've traveled throughout time?
Yes, I focused on in the beginning, I focused on I think four, well, there's five single individual women whose lives I follow in the book. And then there's also a film in here because I like to switch things up and included a film that is actually looking at an entire community of Black men and women and thinking about how their journeys are influenced by spirituality and how their movements actually transform their spiritual practices.
Wow. You know, it's interesting. I'm actually reading a young lady I'm working with is working on a book, and she talked about her travels and how that shaped her beliefs and how she was also able to see the world through different lenses depending on the country that she went to.
Oh yeah,
So that's
absolutely.
kind of what I'm hearing that may have happened in your book.
Absolutely. Space and location plays a big part in the book and how that shapes both the identities of these women, but also their spiritual practices as well.
Wow. So can you maybe tell us about one of the ladies that you spotlight?
Yeah, absolutely. So, just so you have a sense of the scope of this, I actually start in a very unlikely place with a biblical narrative with Hagar. I don't know if you're familiar with Hagar
Yeah.
in the book
Hmm.
of Genesis. Yeah, I
Yeah.
start with her because I'm really interested in all the many kinds of journeys she goes on. I think a lot of times she's just sort of defined as this woman in captivity, right? So her story is basically defined entirely by slavery, but there's so much more going on with her journeys. So she experiences exile, she experiences, escape. She actually runs away. She takes yes, she is enslaved and held captive, but she also has a journey of return where she goes back to her homeland in Egypt. And so there's also a journey of liberation as well. And so I was really interested in all the different ways she moved throughout that narrative. And then I used that as a framework for thinking about the complexity of Black women's movements in later time periods. So I look at three Black women in the 19th century, Zilpha Elah, Amanda Berry Smith, and Nancy Prince. And then I look at a film in the 20th century, and I look at Saida Hartman's 2008 travel narrative, Lose Your Mother, because I'm interested in charting a legacy of Black women's travel. In part because I didn't see that represented culturally out in the world, even though I had a grandmother who traveled all over the world. And she created opportunities for me to travel. So I knew Black women were traveling. I just didn't get to see that anywhere. I didn't get to see it in stuff I was reading in school, and I didn't get to see it in magazines or anywhere else on TV. And so that's sort of what inspired the book, that and then working with students in the classroom and hearing them talk about travel as though it's not for them. And so I wanted to make sure that this sort of fuller portrait of Black people's experiences and Black women's experiences is accessible for everyone.
Interesting. That's an interesting angle that you took.
Yeah, it
Um,
is.
It is.
Something that I think most people don't think about. Although one thing, I had the same teacher, homeroom teacher, in fourth, fifth, and seventh grade, and she went around the world with I think she called it like the International Reading Association, back
Wow.
when Black people just didn't go places like that, So she would come back from her trips and she would have slides. She went to Holland. She went all over Europe, and then she went some other places. And she went, but when she did it, she brought back with her some things, and she was teaching us things in the class. So she was teaching us French because she went to France,
Oh, I
and
love it.
she found
Great.
each of our names, the French version of each of our names, and we had cards on our desk with our French names, and we learned a few, how to ask somebody, "What's your name in French?" and we responded. She was really ahead of her time. She was fearless. She really was. Miss IB Edwards. I mean, she was just an amazing teacher. But that was my real first exposure to people, Black people, actually going places like traveling. And
I
now it's
love
very
that.
common.
Yeah. I know. Yeah, it's much more common now. I think that's what fascinated me about the women in the 19th century is that I wasn't expecting to see Black women traveling around the world in the 19th century because we are just told everyone's enslaved, right?
Mm.
But they traveled all over Europe. Amanda Smith traveled all over Europe. Zilpha Elah traveled to England. Nancy Prince traveled to Russia and Jamaica. And actually, Amanda Berry Smith is the most traveled of all of them. She traveled also to India and different parts of Africa, Egypt, and Sierra Leone and Liberia. And so they were just traveling the places you wouldn't think about Black women traveling to in the 19th century. And, they were also, traveling south and risking their lives.
Mm.
Um, because they could easily be enslaved, even though they were all free at the time that they were traveling south. They could be enslaved, and so they took a lot of risk, as you're saying, in moving through the world. Because one of the things that I think is really important about looking at travelers from the past is they remind us of the repetitions, that the dangers that Black people face as they move through the world today in public spaces, right? That those existed for these women as well, and so I'm interested in those repetitions and what we can learn from the fact that this has never stopped us from moving and from traveling and from going wherever we want to go.
Okay. So is there a common thread, like
There, there
among the
is that.
women?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So one of the common threads, of course, is that vulnerability that they experience when they travel, regardless of where they're traveling to. They are facing threats, sometimes physical. And the interesting thing is the narrative that we get about travel is that it's a pathway to freedom, right? That's why people leave the country, right? Because they can't be free here, so they go elsewhere to be free. But what their narratives show us is that they're still vulnerable when they're abroad and in these international spaces. You've got some of them having to flee for their lives.
Right.
Nancy Prince has to, well, she flees Russia after she sees basically people being burned alive and flogged, after there's a revolt against the czar. And then she flees Jamaica after um, former slaveholders attack newly freed Jamaicans there, burning their property, their lands. And she is supportive of the newly freed Jamaicans there. So she ends up fleeing for her life, from Jamaica. And so the recurring theme is that there is no, home out there in the world that just exists for Black people. That's probably the recurring theme, that if we want home, we have to create it. Um, and so that's sort of what really inspires me about the women as well, as we see them doing what they can to create what one of the authors calls free territory. And wherever they are, they create that as a free space. And so I'm really interested in the ways that they do that, because I think that's something we still should be called to do today as well, right? We create freedom where we are, regardless of what the larger cultural space or landscape looks like.
It's kind of a sad sentiment that nowhere in the world can be called home.
Well, I think that with the place that these women end up is that home is what you create, right? You have to create a home space for yourself and for others. You have to decide these are the boundaries that are sacred, and this is the space that's going to be home and that I'm going to protect.
Right.
Um, and so that's really, I think, the space that they end up.
Um, I was thinking about some of your background that you talked about in your bio, and a lot of your education has been in PWI settings.
Mhm.
Um, Most of it, I think, from what you
Yep.
described. And how does that inform your writing in terms of what you decide to focus on or where your interests are, if it does?
Well, I do think that the work I do now, which is about bringing Black women's voices and experiences and contributions to the forefront, grows out of that experience of feeling marginalized. And so I know what it's like to be in classrooms where, authors, Black authors are not being taught, where you're not reading them. And where if you are in a space where you're reading them, we've got students complaining about why do we have to read these authors? And that's sort of what influenced me to kind of go into higher education in the first place. It was like, well, we clearly need more Black teachers.
Right.
And we need more Black books. So that was sort of the inspiration for me wanting to write and wanting to become a teacher in the first place, were the experiences that I had in predominantly white classroom settings, and realizing the importance of having access to these texts, which I think has become even more important now that we see that the access is sort of being taken away in a lot of spaces. I think that work has become even more important today. So I'm really excited that we have spaces like this.
Well,
Interestingly enough, I went to a PWI myself. I went to Loyola University in New Orleans,
Okay.
and I was explaining this to a group over the weekend that I actually had. I learned more about my culture and more about my history attending a PWI. One, because we had a very strong Black student union, and so we had a great sense of community. But we also had professors who were very unapologetic about teaching African American literature. I mean, we had a Harlem Renaissance class, and I learned so much about authors I had never heard of before. And I graduated from a Black university, from a Black high school. But when I went to this PWI and having the instructors that I had, they wanted to make sure that we understood our history, understood our culture, and not just understood it, but had an appreciation for it. And so I even talked with a friend of mine who was going to an HBCU, and he said he felt that we over at the PWI had more of an appreciation for our culture. We had more of a community, probably because there were less of us. And so even though there's cliques everywhere, we had a bit more of a community there, and we shared more, I believe, is what he said he saw. The difference being where we went versus where he went.
Yeah, I've actually heard that before. And I've been having ongoing conversations with my colleagues at my university about the number of um, Black focused courses we offer, because I teach at a PWI as well, and that it far exceeds what you would ever get at HBCU. And part of that is we have students who demand to have classes that speak to their
Yeah,
experience, because that is the only way that they get to be in a space that is affirming, really. And so it's interesting how that context of being kind of marginalized and minoritized leads you to create more of these courses and spaces that focus on Black culture and Black history and Black literature. So yeah.
absolutely. Because we did demand those classes. We wanted
Yeah,
those classes
that's right. That's
and
right.
made
yeah,
sure they were filled.
Yeah,
yeah. Now Rhonda
absolutely.
was lucky, and Rhonda's younger than me too. But I went to Georgetown, so and when I went, there wasn't any. It was not nothing affirming. There was no African American anything. It's not studies. We did have we had the Black student, the BSA.
Mhm.
But what I found is this interesting. Something I found out years later, talking to an alumnus that was there before me, like 4 or 5 years before me. They had a very active group of Black people, but because they were so active and outspoken, Georgetown lowered the numbers.
Wow.
So by the time I was there was no, I mean, it was so, we didn't have any power. We had no power. We had a Black house. That was it. the BSA. We had a house we could go to on campus, but we we were so spread out. When you said that you were the only Black person in your class, ditto. It was the only time I wasn't the only Black person in my class was if it was like 200 people in the class. Then there'd be two Black people. And normally they'd be on the other side of the room, and a lot of times you never did get to talk to them. So, so it was not affirming. You were made to feel invisible, like you really didn't belong there. And we lost a lot of people along the way from the time I was a freshman to when I graduated. We had about 100 Black people when I was a freshman. And when I marched 4 years later, I think there were about 25 of them.
Wow.
Oh, wow.
We lost them to all kinds of stuff,
Yeah.
nervous breakdowns, just flunking out, just not financially, not being able to, stay financially. Just it was not affirming. So I'm glad some now I also met somebody 10 years after and it was better. So an alumnus that graduated 10 years after I did. It got better after it was more people, it got better. And they added because when I was there, they didn't have fraternities or sororities. None of the Divine Nine were at Georgetown. And the year I graduated, they started a Q chapter. The year I graduated, I think they had 4 people on the line. But so they probably have it, after that, they probably did. But it was not affirming at all. And I experienced more racism at Georgetown than I had ever experienced in my life before that. And I was in North Carolina and Virginia. But it was not nice, I'll say that. But I did get a good education. I tell people I got a good education. I learned how to compete with the wealthy prep school type people, academically and intellectually. So I learned how to do that. It was important. So, and it pushed me into entrepreneurship early on because I did not want to spend time in corporate America dealing with those people day after day after day, because that was who I was going to be working with in corporate if I went the corporate route. So I didn't.
Yeah,
What's
that makes me think about survival skills, the
Yeah.
things that enable us to survive in these spaces. And for me, that's sort of what Black Books did for me, is they gave me a home, a space where I knew I belonged, and I knew that maybe the space that I was in was not affirming, but I knew that those spaces existed because I saw them in books. And so I think all the time about what Jacqueline Woodson says about books needing to be windows and mirrors for kids. They need to be able to both see themselves reflected in the books, but they also need to be able to see the wider world, have access to a bigger world beyond their specific experience right now. And so
They
that's
do.
what Black Books have done for me.
And
and
and it's challenging. And your teachers, they're so vital to your educational experience. I had one Black professor at Georgetown. It changed my whole life there.
and that can happen.
That one.
That was why I
That's
had an appreciation for the instructors that I had when I went to Loyola, because they were very unapologetic in making sure that we read Black authors. And
and
that's
that's
kind of what I
great.
wanted to ask you, Dr. Tisha, is I was looking at your author statement, and you said reading Black authors made you feel seen and less alone as you navigated spaces and places that weren't designated for you. And inspired by your favorite authors, Bell Hooks and Toni Morrison, two amazing authors, by the way, that you became an author to make visible the contributions, stories, and experiences of Black women who were often excluded from conversations about history, literature, religion, travel, and politics. And I feel like you did that with this book.
Mm, thank you. Yeah, I had a mentor, because we're talking about, faculty members, teachers who really changed our lives. I had a mentor at my undergraduate institution. He knew I was going to get a good education, but I wasn't going to get the whole education I needed from the curriculum in the classroom. And so he basically gave me an underground education. And so he
Mm-hmm.
gave me a list of authors I needed to read and sent me to the library. And Bell Hooks was first person on the list. And so, you know, back in those days when there were actual stacks in the library, you would find one book and then you'd find a whole bunch in the same area. And so I would just sit in the stacks and read bell hooks. And I went through all of them. And so yeah, I was amazed at just how young she was when she wrote Ain't I a Woman. That was so inspiring to think that she was, you know, college age writing a book like that. So that was inspiring for me. And then Toni Morrison was inspiring for an entirely different reason. One of my favorite quotes by her is she says, if you can't find the book you want to read, then write it.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so yeah,
Yeah.
so they were
And
really
that's
the two sources of inspiration for believing that I could, you know, be a writer.
mm. They had a documentary about Toni Morrison that was in theaters, but I think it was like limited in theaters, and we had some tickets to go see the premiere of it. And it was before she passed.
Yes.
When it came, it seemed like it came out like a year before she passed, or not too long before she passed. And one thing, when she talked about um, somebody being excited or being driven by having their foot on somebody's neck, and what kind of person is that? That's what makes them feel good, is keeping somebody else down. She said it says more about the person that's feeling good about doing it than it does about the person that's the victim.
Absolutely.
And
yeah, that was a great documentary.
Yeah, she had a lot of profound statements, and I learned a lot about her. I didn't know she was an editor first. That's how I learned. I learned her backstory. I didn't know about that, and so I learned a lot about her. And her son wrote two amazing novels. Um, and I can't call his name right now, just because we're having this conversation.
That's how it happened.
But he wrote two amazing. Standing at the Scratch Line was one of them. And if I can look up Standing at the Scratch Line and who authored it, and then he wrote a sequel to it, but I can't remember the title of the sequel. But two of the most amazing books I ever read. I mean, and that's all he did. He just wrote those two and stopped. I have to find his name because it's going to drive me nuts.
Oh, see,
But
it's gonna bother her the rest of the night. She's
it
gonna miss.
is. I'm going to look it up right now.
Tell me who it is.
While you're looking, I will tell you that Toni Morrison does make a feature in the book. I couldn't write this book without talking about Toni Morrison. I actually can't teach African American literature without talking about Toni Morrison and without having my students read something by her. She's that important, I think, for the tradition. But I think that I bring her in because one of the arguments she makes is that, you know, her kind of calling as the Black woman writer is to really speak into the silences and gaps that she sees in history and in the past, and what's missing from the sort of the earlier works of African American writing. And so she really was always committed to moving the voices of Black women and Black girls to the center, from the margin to the center. And of course, that was Bell Hooks's argument as well, the need to move Black women from the margin to the center. And so that's what I really tried to do with this book.
It was Guy Johnson. I couldn't remember. So his first book was Standing at the Scratch Line, and then he wrote a sequel to it, and the sequel was called Echoes of a Distant Summer. And his books had really strong, they were historical fiction. They were both more like in the late 1800s and there. And I read them like 20 years ago. So, but he had very strong male characters. He had, you know, no nonsense. I'm not going to take your stuff. You know, he would shoot people. You know, he would do whatever it took to defend his and what was his, and to stand his own ground. And just amazing character. If you ever get a chance, they're very thick. They're both like 500 pages a piece, but they are really excellent books. And it's amazing that he you know, adopted her or inherited her writing abilities. It's just amazing. And I think he passed away too. if I'm not mistaken. I don't want to call him dead if he's not, but it seems like I heard that he did.
Well, we did put your link in the chat. So I know the book has been out for about a year almost.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay.
At the
So do
one
you
year
plan on writing
anniversary.
another one? I'm sorry.
At some point. I do. I do. I've really enjoyed spending the past year talking about this book because it still excites me. It hasn't gotten old yet. But yeah, I do plan on writing another one. It'll probably be about leadership because that's sort of the space that I'm in right now, and I'm thinking a lot. I'm still thinking about Black women and, but this time a legacy of leadership wisdom that they offer us. I think that oftentimes we think we have to reinvent the wheel, and we've got this whole tradition of Black women who have come before us. Many of them didn't have titles, but they were leading, and they've offered us models for leadership that I think we can really draw from and learn a lot from. So that'll probably be the next project.
Well, absolutely. I mean, and you still have a lot of life in your current book, so there's no need to even rush. I mean, it sounds like you've been invited to speak in so many places on this subject, and it's taken you to a lot of different places. That's what I'm hearing.
Yes, absolutely. It has lots of different audiences and communities have been interested in the book, which is what's been exciting. When I wrote it, I really wanted it to be more public facing, even though it's an academic book. And so I really love that there's been cross generational interest and, educational spaces, yes, but also just community spaces, church spaces have been interested in the book. So yeah, I think there's something for everyone in it. So yeah, that's been exciting.
That's wonderful.
Someone, one of the viewers, Brandon Brooks, said that the pieces I am, the Toni Morrison documentary,
Yes.
is on Netflix.
It sounds like you might know Brandon
Yeah,
Brooks.
that's what it
I
seems
do.
like.
I
Okay.
do. Yeah. That would be my very supportive partner.
Oh,
Yay!
okay. Wow, well, he's on it. He said the Toni Morrison documentary is on Netflix. So for those of you all who want to watch it and who haven't seen it, or who want to rewatch it, just as a refresher to remind you of just how amazing she was, it's on Netflix. So go and enjoy it. So anyway, Tisha, thank you so much for being a guest on Black Authors Matter TV, and continued success with you and your writing and everything.
Thank you so much. It's been great talking with you.
It was great talking with you as well. Best wishes in all you're doing.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.